Some of the biggest challenges that you face in this field is watching human suffering and the persistence there, where people may have access to support, they receive counseling, they, may not stabilize and continue to use substances. And it impacts them and their family. They don't have housing, they're not eating food, they're sick, they're not getting medically treated. And, they continue to do that. I think that is one of the biggest challenges, just watching people suffer. My father was 52 when he was diagnosed with esophagus cancer, which spread throughout his body pretty rapidly. So it went to his lungs and brain, and he had a few short weeks to live, but he was in a lot of pain. And they tried to induce a coma, and my father came out of it because he had a tolerance to those kinds of things. So he'd used so many drugs that he was able to tolerate the kind of medication they used to put him under so he wouldn't suffer. So he did suffer. He suffered a lot. And at the end, my dad was on 1 liter of morphine a day, and as part of this end-of-life care, and was getting hydrated by that. And they had to go through a vote at the hospital to be able to give him more morphine, which was not legally allowed because New York don't have assisted suicide stuff there. So they had to take their ethical route and give him extra morphine toward the end so he could comfortably just die. And it's hard to sort of separate that in people's minds that, methadone is, just another drug, or it's a Band-Aid, but they don't understand that methadone connected with counseling helps. So recovery too is another word that I'm not very comfortable with because it means to go back to, and it's used, I think, generally for medical stuff. Like if you break your leg, you want to go back to where you were before you broke your leg. You want to, be normal again, right? So healing, so recovery makes sense there. But when it comes to substance use or addiction, most people use substances because they're dealing with something that was painful. So if you're using substances to mask symptoms, you don't want to go back to where you were with the inability to manage those symptoms. So you want the person to have a reformed way of thinking about things in the world, a reformed way of sort of seeing reality, managing symptoms, dealing with stressors, and thinking about themselves. A lot of people have very poor self-images that contributes to shame and anger, which makes it, very difficult to manage. And when you are overwhelmed like that, you want to mask that as well too, so you'll continue to use. So I think reformation is a much better word to use than recovery. You have to address the original reason that they started using substances, and mostly it's trauma-related. So they're trying to medicate their symptoms, their pain, their loss, their grief. And, it's overwhelming for a lot of people to deal with anxiety, especially if they have panic attacks, and then they have depression, if they have, trauma, and a lot of them have PTSD. It affects relationships, right? So they have a hard time connecting with others, and this makes them defensive. So they're sometimes their biggest barrier to getting support and help is their fear of being hurt and rejected. So these are difficult things that take a long time to address, and sometimes the resistance, can extend their suffering for quite some time. Some of the cab companies don't operate within our structure. So if we schedule the client to come in for a counseling session that should last about 30 minutes to 40 minutes, or a group session for 1 hour, the cab company is supposed to drop them off and then pick them up 45 minutes or an hour later, and they're not doing that. They're leaving the clients there, or they're forcing them to get back out of the clinic within 15 minutes before they're threatened to be abandoned there. So it's affecting their therapy. So that's one of the other side effects of using substances I don't think many people think about, that I got to see personally. And I'm like, so the amount of suffering that comes all the way to the end, can be pretty heartbreaking. So I really want to help people not suffer. It's my mission.